as I was saying, I've been saying everybody lives somewhere, so it's our responsibility to make wherever we live habitable, right? There was your dad led a Back to Africa movement that got him hemmed up in a way that I'm sure he didn't imagine. In some parts, he was in alignment with the Klan, who also wanted black people out and back to Africa. So that was a wild kind of allegiance. Where are we now in the struggle for humanity and the struggle for justice?
Well, I think we're at a similar crossroads that we're at 100 years ago, because 100 years ago it was after, shall we say, World War I, significant devastation across the world, people fighting for democracy, and African Americans trying to understand their position in the United States and in the world, because it was also a period of colonialism. And at the present time, I think we still see the hegemony of the United States of America, the hegemony of Europe across the world, and we still see African people trying to, shall we say, maximize their own resources, as well as imposing, shall we say, their own identity on the world scene. So I don't think a heck of a lot has changed in 100 years, because that was what my dad was about, in terms of empowering African people across the world, not just in the United States in terms of, shall we say, civil rights, but as an anti-colonial champion, because at that time, 1884, as you know, 1885, we were colonized, meaning African people were colonized both in Africa and in the Caribbean. And he was born in 1887, so he grew up, what shall we say, under the British Empire, the yoke of the British Empire. So he was an anti-colonial champion as well as a civil rights champion in the United States. And he tried to show us that we were a global people, meaning that we weren't just Africans in Africa, but Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad, that we had an identity, we had a culture, we had a history, and we had traditions. And we didn't need to borrow anybody else's culture or adopt anybody else's culture to be legitimate. We had legitimacy of our own that historically, went further back than anybody else's history and culture. So that was
Yes.
what it was all about, African dignity, African self-respect, and African empowerment in terms of reconstructing our civilization
You,
post-slavery
you know, the
colonialism.
lunacy of understanding, because there was no race prior to the 1500s in this country, in this world. No, nobody was black, nobody was white. Whiteness didn't exist. Everybody had their own places that from whence they came, but it was not based on this hierarchy of race. And the fact that we don't even teach that in schools, that race is a made up construct, I think
Mhm.
it's amazing. I do this thing on Saturdays with Dr. Gray Carr called In Class with Carr. I know you've sat with Dr. Gray Carr from Howard University, but he
Mhm.
said something one of these Saturdays. That Africans are the grandparents of the world,
Yeah.
DNA wise, and I was like, huh, and that it's upside down to have the folk that when I say the folk, the DNA that created all things
Yeah.
to be subjugated to, anything is wild to me, right? And so this is not about, this tribe or that tribe. This is about understanding that humanity comes forth through this. And so we have to protect it at all costs. For you, sitting at the feet of your dad, carrying the torch, um, are you optimistic? Are you staying in Florida? Are you leaving? Like because you're here, you didn't go back. I know you have a place in places. I'm gonna say less, but you're here though. You're an American.
Yes, I'm here. In some sense, I've grown accustomed to here. I have my kids here, my grandkids are here, so that I have roots here, although I was born in Jamaica. But again, I consider myself a world citizen. I consider myself a member of the human race. And as you say, separate races is a European concept. It never existed in the world before Europeans wanted to identify themselves as some sort of superior race, which is a false notion. And we have this idea, for example, of American exceptionalism. There's nothing exceptional about America at all. They're just people who came here, destroyed the Native Americans, committed genocide, and stole the land and brought our ancestors here as slaves. despite the propaganda in terms of the American Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. So that has to be looked at in the mirror. It has never been looked at properly. And most of us, who shall we say, are other than Europeans, are sick and tired of European hegemony. It's been going on for 500 years. Europe needs to look in the mirror and see that they're not the only people on the planet, and they have a false history. Nothing started with the Greeks. The Greeks were newcomers to civilization. African civilization existed, for thousands of years before the Greeks when they were barbarians. Kemet has a prehistory of 40,000 years. That's why it was so great. So, we have nothing to apologize for. We're the original people in terms of where the DNA, human DNA came from in terms of Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanganyika, and so on and so forth. That's proven, and we have the original civilizations. Again, that's proven. I mean, no civilization has lasted as long as Kemet, Kush, Nubia, Ethiopia, etc. 3,000, 4,000 years. So we are the parents and the grandparents of humanity, and that needs to be respected. Unfortunately, the history has been destroyed, it's been corrupted, it's been turned upside down. I think you used that, and that's exactly right. The history of the world has been turned upside down, as if to say Europeans are somehow, the prima donnas of the human race. But they're not. They're in some sense Johnny-come-lately, and they're still not anything other than a technological civilization. All you have to do is look around us here, even in the United States of America, and we can see that the culture itself is fighting itself. And how many wars has America been in? The First World War, the Second World War, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the wars continue. How is that a civilization? It's a destructive civilization, if you want to call it that. It's not putting humanity first. I mean, civilization is about the civilizing of the human being within society. That has not occurred, I would say, anywhere in Europe, because they've raped the rest of the world. I think we need to look at that and learn lessons from the history.
Hi, Dr. Garvey. My name is Sina Ghaznavi, co-host for today. It's a pleasure to meet you. I'm wondering, there's a kind of a cratering that capitalism has done in much of the world. Can you talk about how a lot of people are saying we're almost maybe in the death throes of capitalism, and what you may see as the future 50, 100 years from now? I don't really care much about the next 4 or 8 years, but really looking much farther into the future.
Well, I think we need to define terms. I think capitalism really is about using capital, but it depends on how you use capital. It's like if you say agriculture, it's how you use land. But you can use land where the elite have 10,000 acres and they have slaves working on the land. So that's agriculture. But it's not the type of agriculture that we want. We need smallholder farmers, etc., etc. So it's not the type of capitalism that we want. So I don't believe in communism or socialism per se. I believe in the use of capital, but I think it needs to be used appropriately. For the benefit of the majority of the people who it should be serving. And if you look, for example, if we can jump straight to China, China is state capitalism, and it has moved more people out of poverty than any other system has done. Within the last 50 years, it has moved 500 million people out of poverty, which is fantastic. I don't know that any other system has ever done that, and I know not any other system can do that. So I think when you say capitalism, I'm including all forms of capitalism in that sense. I think what we have is voracious capitalism, which is basically an updating of feudalism. So it's a feudal type of capitalism, and I think that has to go, because that is destroying the world. If it is consuming our resources, it's not sustainable in terms of its products, meaning that it is destroying the planet per se. We don't have clean air, we don't have clean water, we have climate change, we can't even take care of our garbage. Garbage is piling up, and the resources are being used up at such a rate that is not sustainable in terms of planetary dimensions. So I think there's an end for that. And I think the end, maybe the climate crisis, as well as the resource crisis. That's why there's a second round of raping Africa, shall we say, or attempting to recolonize Africa, even though, most of the African countries have been independent. Well, certainly it's the richest continent in the world, and we see everybody going back there again for resources because
I said it's 1500s Portugal all over again, and now it's cobalt. It's the things they need for these batteries. It's tech in Kenya using the actual brain power and paying them pennies on a dollar to create trillion-dollar companies, and it's starving folk out to do the same thing that they did before. And now we have these countries that didn't exist, all of these borders, because when you look at the map of the largest continent, that China, the United States, Canada, all Russia could all fit into the landmass of Africa, these borders have been made in a room somewhere, right? These borders don't really exist other than people colonizing these different spaces and divvying up parts of the land. And some would argue, well, that's what made Africans weak, the fact that you allowed that to happen. But Africans didn't see themselves as one people. This race thing is a made-up construct, and it's very powerful. It's very powerful. Dr. Garvey is here. There's a new book out we're going to talk about in a second, Sina Ghaznavi. But, leading up to the election, there was a lot of division the last couple of years among African Americans. They called them foundational Black people and Black people from other places. And there was this division fomented. And I was like, that's how we got the first time. Stop it. It was so frustrating to watch it. Are you optimistic that that we might actually now have an opportunity to finish the work that your dad started?
Well, in a sense, that's the purpose of the book, because it's very well brought out there, especially the chapter there by Justin Hansford, who brings out the whole socio-political milieu at the time in the 20s, when my dad came here in 1916. And the organization really took off, leaps and bounds, and he ended up with, 4 million, 6 million adherents in a very short period of time in the early 20s. So this was something that obviously people wanted at that particular time. It was post World War One. There was the revolution in Russia. There were changes happening worldwide. And the agricultural African American had moved north, so to speak, as part of the Industrial Revolution that took place. And of course, because of the needed labor, when so many young white men went to war in terms of 18. So there was a whole change in the demography, shall we say, of the African American, moving from agriculture, moving to the industrial north into cities, like New York and Chicago, Philadelphia and Detroit. But African Americans wanted to live in their own communities because they had been abused in terms of sharecropping, etc., and lynching in the South. So they wanted to have their own communities, and they wanted their own identity. And this was what Marcus Garvey came into and gave them the understanding that they had this history, because he always pointed to Africa. He pointed to Ethiopia in terms of our civilization. So he gave them that self-respect, that dignity, and saying, yes, let's form our own communities, because the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, the second half of it was African Communities League. So it was about developing African communities. And the African American responded to that. As I said, there were 6 million, adherents. And, 1920, International Conference of the Negro Peoples of the World. Never happened before. More than 2,500 delegates from all over the world. So this was a transformative moment in terms of the existence of African people worldwide, but especially in the United States. What that did was that it challenged then the other political ideologies, meaning the communist socialist ideology, which was a worldwide ideology, and you had African Americans who were communists, the so-called African blood brothers, etc. That was one group, and you had others who were socialists, and then you had the integrationists, meaning the NAACP, etc., who felt that all they needed to do really to solve the problem was to integrate, with the majority community. Marcus Garvey, well, was firmly in the Booker T. Washington arena, shall we say, in terms of, self-development based on economic foundation. So those were the ideologies that were challenging each other. And of course, Marcus Garvey was preeminent in that sense in terms of membership. And the NACP membership was falling. The socialists or communists tried to take over the organization. They failed. But then they did something, which was very destructive because they appealed, to J. Edgar Hoover, the Attorney General, etc., to destroy Marcus Garvey. Instead of having the debate and allowing the community to decide what they wanted in terms of going forward, what they saw as the best way to go forward, because of selfishness and their intensity in the belief in their own ideology, they decided to subvert the Garvey organization. And of course, that's how J. Edgar Hoover, got his idea of charging Marcus Garvey with using the mails to defraud relative to the Black Star Line. And as you know, that was a hoax. That there was no evidence, there was no fraud, and nothing was really proven. Although he ended up getting, a jail sentence, etc., and spending 3 years in jail, etc., etc. And that's documented in the book. But the purpose of the book is for us to look at that period and learn our lessons. Have we learned anything in 100 years? That's the point.
Yeah, Dr. Garvey, I was actually going to ask that. What, you kind of answered it just now. It's like, what lessons have we learned from that? And, do you even see even what's happening economically in Africa, where you have a lot more foreign investment from China and from these other places and stuff? Do you find that there's going to be continued mistakes that are going to be happening, or continued, the continent being taken advantage of by, the European powers or the East Asian powers as well?
Well, I do think that's possible, but I do think that we see changes. Certainly we have seen changes now in the Francophone countries where they're trying to get rid of France, who have maintained basically their colonial status with about 14, 15 countries that they have never, given their freedom in that sense, but they've been tied to France as colonial entities. So we have like Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali that have walked away, the Sahel region, which is very, very positive. And I think we also see a lot of young people on the continent who are rising up and challenging the leadership that has in some sense sold them out. We saw that in Kenya, when the young people, rose up against the president in terms of his own ideology, and he had to back off from that. And that is happening, across the continent. And I think it's important too that we have both Russia and China involved. Because now there are more people in the arena, shall we say, looking at African resources. And all that African leaders have to do is be intelligent to be able to make the best deal. If you have 4 or 5 people coming at you and they want the same thing, well, go with the guy who's going to give you the best deal. So you have the possibility now of dealing with China or dealing with Russia, not just with the United States and the European Union. So I see that as a good thing. And as I mentioned, the youth movement, I think is really happening. And I think that's relative to the ability to communicate now with all the different platforms, whether it's WhatsApp and TikTok and so on and so forth. So that young people are getting an education, even when they may not get it in the university or the schools. They get it in this informal sense. And they realize that they have the richest continent, but they're the poorest people. And they're asking the questions why and want to make changes.
We didn't talk about BRICS today, but we will continue to, because, again, we're indoctrinated. We're indoctrinated to believe that all men are created equal, endowed with these inalienable rights, but it doesn't play out in real time. The founding fathers and the framers were great people who also owned human beings, did brutal things to the land, did brutal things to people, but we don't ever share that. There's a reckoning that's going on right now. We must tell the truth. So I'm appreciative that you have this book. Ta-Nehisi, who is having a moment, wrote the foreword for Justice for Marcus Garvey. Justice for Marcus Garvey. Look for me in the whirlwind. There's also a documentary that has that same title, so y'all could check that out. But the contributors here, not just Ta-Nehisi and Kichi Taifa. You have Wade Hudson. Shout out to them. Some venerable folk who have been in the space for a while. Dr. Adam Ewing contributing to this. Maulana Karenga. Y'all can say what you want, but every day is Kwanzaa here on the Karen Hunter Show, because we chew up the meat. We chew up the meat. We chew up what's good. We take what's good here, and we build, which is what you're saying. Negotiate for the things that you can use to build the world that you want to live in. We have power. And so the impetus of this book is to help clear your father's name as well.
Yes, definitely, definitely. Hopefully it will have some effect on the president, who is going to be president until January the 20th. So we keep pushing. We have communicated with the administration previously that they have not done, the posthumous presidential pardon, which we would hope to say that no crime was committed and that it was a major injustice. So we're still looking for that.
So Joe Biden still has a chance to do that. And what would that do for your father's legacy to have him exonerated?
One step in the right direction, and it's important, I think, for America itself to be able to say, well, look, an injustice was committed 100 years ago, and we are righting that. That's a step to looking in the mirror. That's at least some movement. We need at least a 90-degree movement, shall we say? But that's maybe 1 or 2 degree movement in terms of getting America to look in the face of what it has done in terms of African Americans over time. So, I will keep pushing, and of course, the end result has to be justice.
Yes, this book just came out this month. Ta-Nehisi wrote the foreword. His dad also participated, Paul Coates. I see his name in the credits as well. Justice for Marcus Garvey. Look for me in the whirlwind. Get it now. Thank you so much for always engaging with us, but also know that we are aligned. So, happy holiday to you and your beautiful family, and thank you for being here today.